tend to play. Some call it love.
There's a moment in Love Under New Management. Not the lyrics, just the way Miki Howard holds a note, where it feels like she's finally choosing herself. And for a while, that voice could control a room, but not her own life. Because artists like that don't just disappear, not without something shifting behind the scenes. To the public, she was a quiet storm diva who came and went. But that's not the version most people remember. Behind that voice was a story about love, power, and a slow, almost invisible kind of loss. So, what really happened to Miki Howard? Let's fade to black. To understand Miki Howard, we have to go back to late 1960s Chicago, where music wasn't a dream, it was the atmosphere she grew up breathing. Born into a gospel family, with parents who were already performers, singing wasn't something she chose, it was something expected. Church stages, rehearsals, traveling shows. From an early age, she learned how to deliver emotion on cue, how to move people without ever centering herself. And that's where the tension quietly begins, because the talent was always there. The voice didn't need development, it needed direction. But her identity, that was shaped around other people, around what the room needed, around what the moment demanded. Before she ever became a star, she understood what it meant to support one. In her early career, she spent time as a background vocalist, reportedly working in circles connected to legends like Aretha Franklin, learning how to stay just behind the spotlight while still carrying the weight of the performance. And maybe that's the part that matters most, because by the time the industry finally looked her way, she already knew how to stand behind someone else. She knew how to hold a note, but not yet how to hold her ground. By the late 1980s, Miki Howard was no longer standing behind the spotlight. She stepped into it. Signing with Atlantic Records, she entered an industry that was still making space for real vocalists. Artists who didn't just perform songs, but felt them all the way through. Her debut album, Come Share My Love, didn't arrive with massive hype, but it didn't need to. The voice carried it, and people noticed. The record climbed the R&B charts, not because it followed a trend, but because it resisted one. There was something almost out of time about her delivery. Less polished, more exposed. She didn't sound like she was chasing perfection. She sounded like she was telling the truth. But it was her next phase that defined everything. Love Under New Management wasn't just a hit, it was a statement. The kind of song that felt personal even when you heard it alone. And when she performed it, there was no distance between her and the audience. No choreography, no spectacle, just presence. Her voice didn't glide, it pressed. It carried a weight that felt closer to testimony than performance. Like she wasn't just singing about love, but surviving it. Every note stretched just enough to feel like it might break, but never did. That was her power. And in the Quiet Storm era, where intimacy mattered more than image, that kind of authenticity still had a place. Radio made room for voices like hers. Late-night rotations, slow jams, songs that lingered long after they ended. For a moment, everything aligned. She had the voice. She had the audience. She had the song that defined her. But the ground was already shifting. Because while she was building her identity around emotional truth, the industry was beginning to move in a different direction. New Jack Swing was rising. Faster beats, sharper visuals, artists who were as much about image as they were about sound. And that shift came with a new kind of pressure. To adapt, to modernize, to become something more marketable. At the same time, her personal life was no longer separate from her public one. Relationships, emotions, attachments, they weren't just influencing her music anymore. They were starting to shape how she moved through the industry itself. And that's where things begin to blur. Because when your voice is built on honesty, and your life becomes complicated, the line between performance and reality doesn't just thin, it disappears. She was winning. The charts said so. The audience felt it. But something quieter was already pulling at the center of it all. Not loud enough to stop the moment, not visible enough to name, but strong enough to change where it was going. She was rising, but not entirely in control of where she would land. By the early 1990s, Miki Howard was still visible, but the way the industry saw her was beginning to narrow. At Atlantic Records, she was supported, but not fully built around, not in the way top-tier acts were. The push was there, but the long-term investment, the kind that shapes eras, felt more cautious, more conditional. And at the same time, the sound of R&B itself was changing. The industry was moving away from slow, vocal-driven storytelling towards something sharper, faster, more visual. New Jack Swing wasn't just a sound, it was a shift in priorities. Image started to matter as much as voice, sometimes more. On stage, she was still powerful, still controlled, a voice that could quiet a room without trying. But behind the scenes, that control didn't fully belong to her. Producers shaped the sound, labels shaped the direction, and artists, especially women, were often shaped by something even more personal. Because in that era, a female artist wasn't just evaluated by her music. She was evaluated by who she was connected to, who she loved, who stood next to her when the cameras were on. And slowly, that layer began to matter more than it should have. The story wasn't just about songs anymore, it was about relationships. But the real shift wasn't happening in the studio. There's a version of love under new management that lives on stage. Not the studio recording, but the way Miki Howard performs it in front of a crowd. The way her voice leans into certain notes, stretches certain phrases, like she's not just singing the story, she's stepping back into it. And every time, the audience responds the same way. They cheer. Because to them, this is a song about freedom, about walking away, about finally choosing yourself after loving the wrong person for too long. You can feel it in the room, that sense of victory, that release. But according to interviews and accounts from that period, real life wasn't always that clean. The narrative the audience heard, and the reality she was living, didn't fully match. And that's where the image becomes difficult to forget. A woman standing under stage lights, singing about reclaiming her power, while, behind the scenes, she may still have been entangled in the very kind of love the song is trying to escape. That contradiction doesn't explode. It just sits there, quiet, unresolved. That's the part that stays with me. Because sometimes, the strongest performances aren't about distance. They're about proximity to something you haven't fully left yet. Because sometimes the song is the truth, just not the whole truth. By the early 1990s, something had shifted, not suddenly, but noticeably. For Miki Howard, the momentum that once felt natural began to slow. The records were still there, the voice hadn't changed, but the charts told a different story. Each release landed a little softer, stayed a little shorter, reached a little less. At the same time, another narrative was getting louder. Her relationship with Gerald Levert began to define how people saw her, not just privately, but publicly. It became part of the conversation, part of the framing, part of how her presence in the industry was understood. And around them, the industry kept moving. New voices were rising, younger, sharper, more aligned with where R&B was heading. The aesthetic was changing, the sound was changing, and the artists who adapted fastest were the ones who stayed visible. She didn't disappear overnight. There was no collapse, no scandal to point to, no final performance that marked the end. Just a gradual shift, from headline to supporting mention, from defining voice to familiar memory. And the silence didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. A missed opportunity here, a quieter release there, a name that stopped being called as often. Until one day, it simply wasn't. No scandal, no final performance, just silence. After the peak, Miki Howard didn't stop singing. That's important. Her career continued. She released more music. She performed. She remained talented in the way truly gifted singers remain talented, even when the room gets smaller, even when the spotlight moves somewhere else. But it was no longer the same room. The mainstream had shifted. The machine had moved on. And once that happens, an artist can still be present and somehow feel absent at the same time. That's the strange cruelty of public memory. People remember the song. They remember the hook. They remember the feeling of hearing it late at night. But the artist becomes softer in the frame. The woman behind the voice becomes a blur. And for someone like Miki, that kind of fading feels especially heavy, because so much of her music was built on emotional identity. Love wasn't just a theme in her songs. It became part of how people understood her. And once her personal life began to overlap with her professional story, it became harder to separate the singer from the relationship, the gift from the pain, the woman from the narrative placed around her. So what did it cost? Maybe visibility, maybe momentum, maybe the full version of the career she could have had. And maybe that's the question we're not supposed to answer too quickly. What happens if she chooses differently? What happens if the voice comes first? What happens if love doesn't take up so much space? We don't know. And maybe that's the hardest part, not knowing what could have been. In the end, Miki Howard's story isn't just about a singer who had hits, then slowly faded from the center. It's about talent meeting emotional loyalty, and how dangerous that combination can become when the world rewards what you give, but rarely protects what you lose. Because Miki had the voice. That was never the question. The question was whether the people around that voice knew how to protect the woman carrying it, and whether she had ever been taught to protect herself before protecting everyone else. And she wasn't the only one. So many women in R&B were asked to give before they were allowed to keep. Give the voice, give the beauty, give the pain, give the love story, give the silence afterward. Then, when the industry was finished shaping them, the public called it disappearance. But maybe Miki Howard didn't disappear. Maybe she became a reminder that being gifted doesn't always mean being guarded, that singing about freedom is not the same as having it, that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room still needs someone to ask what it cost her to sound that strong. I don't hear her story as failure. I hear it as warning, a soft one, a painful one, but a warning nonetheless. What does it cost to love someone more than you love your own becoming? And if this story made you remember Miki Howard differently, leave a comment, share the memory, and stay with us for the next one.